Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Now, I know we normally bring our guests on at exactly on half past the hour, but I'm rather excited about this because, as you know, I am that worst sort of creature, an armchair historian, and as you also know, one of my particular interests is Germany leading up and through the Second World War. So when this one landed on my desk, I thought, I've been there, I've done that. I know everything there is to know about Germany and the Nazis and who's involved and the social... And then, of course, I as James Brown once famously said, no relation, by the way, he famously said, I may not be right, but I'm never wrong. Well, I'm wrong in this case because this is an absolute belter. The book is called A Model Spy. It's the incredible story of the German spy who seduced and deceived high society, and the man who has shone a light on put this one on the catwalk is John Rory Maclean, and I'm delighted to say he joins me live on the line now. John, good morning, sir.
Good morning to you.
So, whereabouts are you, by the way? Where did we find you this morning?
I'm in Penzance, not particularly sunny Penzance, in Cornwall.
Very a nice part of the world and all that sort of stuff as well.
It's a lovely part of the world.
Right then, so this, like I said before, I always say, and the listeners will be rolling their eyes, he's about to go off on one, because it fits into his folio quite nicely. I kind of thought I knew that the German spy network was pretty rubbish, and then you found this one, and I'm like, I've never heard about this one. And not only does she... Well, you take it away and explain who we're talking about here, Rory.
We're talking about Gisela Klein, who was a young German woman who came to the UK in 1933, and she began to move in high society. She went to Oxford University, ostensibly to study English, and she met a young Jack Profumo, later infamous for the Profumo affair when he was a government minister and there was an accusation of a sex and spying scandal. Now, she met Jack and through him started to move in high society, and she had the golden card that some people are gifted, not me, obviously, but she was very, very beautiful. Even her security file, the British security file on her, described her as striking. And years later, more than 50 years later, a woman who knew her described her as a very beautiful German girl. And this allowed her to move through high society in the UK. And she met many, many people. She modelled for the Royal Couturier in London, and she even dined with Jack Profumo and Nancy Astor at Cliveden. So she was moving in the very highest levels of society. Nancy Astor, incidentally, described her to Jack Profumo as a spy, and this was back in 1935.
So, I mean, she's got that... If you're looking for 1930s classic beauty, I mean, she is that, it's almost sort of Hollywood golden age, isn't it? I looked at the pictures, thought, Garbo, Detroit, that European good looks.
Yes, it's sort of. She looks a bit like a young Grace Kelly. I mean, she is very, very good looking, and like a lot of models, she could put on a lot of different looks. So in a number of her modelling photographs, which I've seen, she looks very different each time, but she's always incredibly glamorous. Coupled with that, it wasn't just that she was good looking; she was also intelligent. She spoke 4 languages. She was very organised. She was involved in arranging any number of fashion shows, and that was on top of her continuous links to members of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and in particular a German Foreign Office spy during the 1930s called Wolfgang Krauss-Brandstetter. Now, he went on a round-the-world spying spree in the 1930s, and he pops up where she pops up on a number of occasions.
Now, the thing, whereabouts in Germany is she from, by the way? What are we talking?
Yeah, she was originally from Dusseldorf, and her connections there were extremely good as well. Her father was a very successful lawyer and bookbinder, and she had a connection. I found a documentary connection to a man called Werner Schwartz, who was the Ruhr's nut and bolt king. Now, that doesn't sound very interesting, but literally his products held the German army together. He was part of the massive military expansion. He was a great mates with Hermann Goering, who made him huntsman for the area, which was a sign of special favour. And he's pictured with Goering later on at a trade fair in Dusseldorf, where he's explaining something technical to him.
Goering makes him huntsman. Goering's got this whole thing about this quasi sort of hunting, shooting, fishing, medieval Germany in his own little opium.
Yeah, it was a serious honour, and so Werner's connections to Goering were extremely good. And he had a documentary link. It was actually looks like a love poem that he sent to Gisela Klein on his own headed memorandum paper.
So where does she? So she speaks languages. Okay, she speaks 4 languages. She's cut from a good background. Her family are independently wealthy. Why does she sort of start to spy, if you like? What attracts her to, I mean, this is going to, obviously, because we can't get our head around it, but what attracts her to supporting the Nazis in such a covert yet, way?
Well, she always said that she was anti-Nazi. Now, that well could have been cover, but I think the reality was that, like a lot of Germans, she didn't like the Nazis particularly. But while they were doing good things for Germany in the 1930s, there were lots of people in the UK who thought exactly that. While they were doing good things, they got the sort of tacit support of people who could broadly be called German nationalists. Now, I think the reality is that she was a German nationalist, and she didn't want to follow the sort of traditional Nazi path of women of becoming a mother to little blonde Hitler
Kinder, etc., yeah,
exactly. And so working for the Abwehr, who weren't necessarily on the same page as Hitler by any means, gave her an opportunity to live the life she wanted outside Germany. And she spent as much time as she could, both before the war and even during the war, where she went to Austria, outside the heart of the Third Reich.
Because I suppose the thing is, if she's a model and international model at this point, that's the cover story. I mean, we're used to having in British intelligence, like Fleming being a journalist to run a network of spies. But if you're two things, you're a model so you can move easily. Obviously, if you're a model, you're rather attractive, and so doors will open for you because people like to have pretty things around, don't they?
Indeed, and there seems to have been a particular relationship with some of the British nobility, in particular Geordie, the 5th Duke of Sutherland, who was a senior member of the royal household at the time of the abdication of Edward VIII, and so would have had extremely interesting information. She kept a number of pictures of him, probably mainly from the south of France, where she was a big figure on the social scene. She also had amazing other connections. She had a direct link to the Kennedy family. Now, Joe Kennedy Sr., as you know, was the UK ambassador in the run-up to the Second World War. Well, she dated, as she told her own daughter, his eldest son, Joe Kennedy Jr. And I discovered that was almost undoubtedly in around 1938, when he was an intern at the Paris embassy, the US Paris embassy. So effectively, she could have had information from both the UK US Embassy and the Paris US Embassy at the same time.
And of course, Kennedy Sr. is very much, anti, which strangely enough seems to be, but he's not a great fan of the Brits, and he doesn't want Americans to get involved with the war as well. So that's an interesting one, isn't it?
No, indeed. I mean, he was an early version of the sort of isolationist America that we have seen up until now, obviously, far more of. He regularly predicted that Britain would lose against Germany, and was quite keen to establish links with Germany. I mean, he made several attempts to meet Hitler. I don't think they came off. And his son certainly held some of his views. During visits to Germany, he expressed very positive views about what Hitler was doing.
So, I mean, the other thing I find interesting, because people might think she's taking snaps. How is she working as a spy? What are they possibly doing? But one of the things that Germany in the mid 30s, after Hitler takes over in 33, is they're trying to show Germany as a forward-thinking nation to be admired, not because they can't say, look at these tanks we're building for war, because obviously that would give the game away. So they're doing it via having a lifestyle, if you like. Science science is a major thing in Nazi Germany. Scientists are rock stars in Germany. Obviously, if you're Jewish, you flee if you can, but otherwise that's why. Gliding clubs. Again, if we knew then what we knew now, obviously you were training the next bunch of Luftwaffe, but gliding was a big thing. Motor racing, a particular thing, Mercedes-Benz, Auto Union, blah, blah, blah. Fashion, because Lena Riefenstahl, we've got the Triumph of the Will, Albert Speer's Cathedrals of Light. I mean, filmmaking in Germany is a big thing. Culture is a big thing. I'd never thought of fashion as a big thing, but there you go.
Yeah, no, there was effectively a Nazi fashion front, and it came to London in the 30s. Effectively, the Germans organised these fashion shows. It was all part of this sort of culture thing to show what a wonderful culture Germany was creating, and how powerful it was. And it was about propaganda. I mean, the reality was that certainly as things progressed and during the war, they continued to do this in countries that they had access to. They would send out, Gisela Klein was involved, they would send out these models wearing the latest German fashions, ostensibly, certainly before the war, to try and raise income for the expansion, the militarization. But it was also mainly a propaganda thing. It was to say, look how good we are, look how clever we are. Hitler was obsessed, in so many ways, was obsessed with fashion, and he loathed the dominance of Paris in couture and wanted particularly to develop a German couture which could be spread throughout the greater Third Reich.
Because, and I'm going to put people's hackles up, but if you look at the uniforms, I mean, obviously what they're doing is horrendous, but there's always, even sort of James Holland and Al Murray have been saying, if you look at what the British Army are wearing in 1939 compared to what the German officers are wearing, there's a stark difference, isn't it? Because of that the fashion, because they're pumping money into fashion, strangely enough.
Well, they understood the power of imagery. And I mean, if you think about it, that was Goebbels' great skill, these huge, great rallies, the whole look of the thing. So they understood the power of fashion and couture as a statement. And I would also argue couture, rather like espionage, is all about disguise. And so for Gisela Klein, that was a clear role for her. It gave her cover. And I also think it's important to say that a lot of spies aren't spies all the time. They've got other jobs. They've got other lives. Spying is just a part of their life. And I think it was just part of her life. She really loved the fashion. I think when she was happiest, she wasn't really spying, when she was working in Austria during the war. And she described that in a letter as one of the happiest times of her life. So I think it's always important to see that spies have other lives, other roles, as well as this information providing role.
So John Profumo, I mean, everybody will know him from the Profumo affair that brings down the Macmillan government, pretty much brings down the Macmillan government. This is 9, but this is 30 years, obviously 30 years before this. So how does she come into his orbit? And I mean, you've described him as basically one of his first steady girlfriends. His own son, who wrote a biography of him, described him as his first steady girlfriend. I mean, he was a man with an eye for the ladies, I think, to put it mildly. But they were really they were a serious item, and his relationship with her lasted, it started before the war. They were still connected during the war because there was some communication between them during the war. She wrote to him in a letter that was intercepted and looked at by MI5. And then he got in contact with her, we know definitively, just after the war, when she was married and living in North Africa. And there seemed to have been a resumption at that stage with some sort of romantic thing, because it caused a lot of trouble between her and her husband. So, I mean, it was a sort of continuous relationship. And of course, it was the thing that drew me into the whole story in the first place, because I was looking up something about the Profumo affair. I couldn't remember much about it and started to do a little bit of research. And she popped up, and I thought that the huge irony that he was known for this scandal in the 60s because Christine Keeler, with whom he had a very brief affair, was also having a relationship with a Russian military attaché. I thought, what an irony. In fact, it was his first girlfriend who was the real spy, because I think the reality was that Christine Keeler wasn't a spy. So Lady Astor, because of woman's intuition, and this is Lady Astor, who is basically, people might not know, but she tends to be in all the great famous Churchill lines, etc. In fact, I mean, there's a woman who knows how to throw a party or a dinner party. She knows people, and she clocks straight away. She's not all that she seems, Rory.
Yes, indeed. I mean, what that is incredibly interesting. She was known to be particularly sharp. I mean, she didn't tend to take prisoners, and not massively keen on young women who she thought might be a threat to her sons. So it's not impossible that part of that observation may have been driven by the fact that she was faced with a very beautiful and intelligent young woman at dinner. However, it would appear that Klein was possibly too interested in the other guests, or gave away her very, very direct views about where Germany should be. And it's interesting that only came up much later. It actually came out during the war, when Jack Profumo seems to have admitted it to someone from the intelligence services. And it appears in the file on her.
So, Profumo notwithstanding, you mentioned the German who will become her husband and the father of her child as well. So, tell me about who this character is, then, please, Rory.
Yeah, Wolfgang Krauss-Brandstetter was the adopted son of a printer, a very successful printing firm, and he seems to have been led a rather charmed life. He led a very privileged life, but he seems to have had a natural capacity for deception. I think basically he would be described as a sort of bad boy, and he worked certainly in the early stage of the war for a black propaganda unit that was based in Paris, a German Foreign Office black propaganda unit. And he was then later associated with the Abwehr Air Intelligence. And that was interesting because Klein was associated with Abwehr Air Intelligence officers on a number of occasions, including some in Vienna, who later came back to Paris with her. So there was a clear connection there. Now Wolfgang certainly was the father of her child. They lived together in Paris, and they just tried to disguise the length of their relationship. When he then, as soon as the Allies arrived in Paris, he tried to go over to them. So basically, he arranged to meet British and American officers and said, look, I want to come and work for your intelligence services, because he obviously saw his future as not being back in Germany. And what happened then was that he made a serious effort to go over, but they didn't trust him. And his attempts to join an interesting man called Sefton Delmer, who was running Britain's propaganda effort with a number of these very strange radio stations broadcasting to Germany, they refused him, possibly because he tried to bribe a British officer at some stage. What he didn't know was that they were being bugged most of the time while he was in the prisoner of war camp. And he tried to bribe a British officer to help him get hold of what he rather unimaginatively called his black fund, which was money he'd hidden away in gold and silver bullion in Paris. Now, once they learned this, they started to go off him rather rapidly.
Indeed. So is she passing anything back to... Because I've always had this idea that the Abwehr are compared to the Crow Bakers at Bletchley Park, and what what the UK is doing. I've always they, when they try and infiltrate agents, they try and drop people in, or it's always they're always sort of wearing +4s in Rochdale or something like that, and asking where that terrible accent. So I've always thought them as not as clowns, because trust me, nothing about them is clownish if they get hold of you, but.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I think what's interesting about that, certainly by the end of the war, the British completely and the US completely dominate the intelligence scene. We obviously had the Double X Committee, which was sending back, we'd captured these agents, turned them, was sending back completely false information, which the Germans were lapping up. However, I think what's interesting is in the mid-30s, Britain was nowhere in terms of intelligence. It basically wasn't there'd have been a huge reduction in intelligence capacity after the First World War. It's the usual thing. The war's finished. We don't need to spend any money on this, so we can use it for other things. So they cut right back. In the meantime, as Hitler's coming up, the Germans are much more on the front foot. And I found a 1934 Abwehr training manual, which was basically telling them agents what they wanted to know from Britain, like, the identifying bomber squadrons, where fuel was stored and things like that. So they were sort of on the front foot. Plus, there was a huge effort to get Britain on side. Hitler, up until about 1935-36, was very interested in knowing more about Britain and actually effectively being being an ally of Britain.
Because, again, dinner parties, hoity-toity people, here we come, it's time for the arrival of the Mitfords, because that is, there you go, beautiful women, Unity Mitford, Adolf Hitler, you could, for goodness sake, Diana Mitford marries bleeding Oswald Mosley, the head of the British Union of Fascists, for goodness sake. So there was that whole, let's not be beastly about the Germans. They obviously Saxe-Coburg, etc., with our own dear royal family. So there's a lot of, Hitler thought that the Germanic peoples, the British were basically, they could be regarded as Aryans as well, and we should have links.
Indeed, and amongst the upper classes, the Mitfords, the others like that, and Geordie Duke of Sutherland, there was a huge swathe of anti-communism, and the Germans, and Hitler in particular, were very keen to portray themselves as a bastion against the Soviet Union. And so there was a lot of fellow feeling, and I think the reality was that in the early to mid-30s, there was a huge swell of certainly upper-class opinion, and it trickled down as well, that regarded Germany and Hitler as a good thing. It was a bastion against communism. We were brothers and sisters under the skin. And so there wasn't the sort of the late, we look back in retrospect and think, oh, what a huge mistake. At the time, people didn't think that. They thought that Germany had been rather badly done by after the Versailles Treaty, which ended the First World War. And it was actually time that it took its place amongst the great nations of Europe.
Look at all those wonderful Zeppelins they're building, and those strong, straight roads and that wonderful rail network. If only we'd known then. Anyway, let's skip forward. It's Paris. It's late 1944, and she's in trouble here. Basically, because the thing is, this story might have finished in 1944 with the fall of Paris, because she's captured, isn't she? But not by the Allies.
No, indeed. As Wolfgang Brandstetter, they've been living together. They've been hiding as the Allies entered Paris, the French and the Americans entered Paris. They were hiding in the flat of a friend together. And at this point, Wolfgang Brandstetter left her. Whether he just walked out, it's not clear from the record, or whether it was something they agreed. I think it was actually something they agreed. I think they had a plan. And got in touch with Allied officers and said, look, here I am. I'm a German military intelligence officer. I'd like to work for you now. Now, in the meantime, she'd been busy as well. She'd been to see the Americans and explained about her great connections and how, she wasn't a pro-Nazi. And apparently they'd been relatively happy about that. And she'd also been to see the French police to say, look, here I am. And they'd sort of helped her by suggesting that she wrote out a timeline of her activities, so that she effectively had a crib for what she'd been doing in Paris, etc., etc. Unfortunately for her, she was dining on the Champs-Élysées in a restaurant. She still maintained very high-level contacts, even at that stage when most Parisians didn't have very much to eat. And she was seized by a group of the forces of the French interior who were doing, I think, an identity card check or something, and arrested, as were thousands of other people. This was the great purge of Paris, where there was a lot of revenge being undertaken, and where hundreds, if not thousands of people were being locked up for collaboration. Anyway, she was swept up in that and endured an extremely tough time indeed. She was regularly interrogated by the French, and she played, I think personally, a blinder. She stonewalled them. She managed to get their sympathy. In the files on her, they even describe her as the very beautiful Klein. So she was able to charm them to a degree. And as a result, they never really found out what she'd been doing in terms of her associations with intelligence officers, her involvement with a economic magazine that was meant to be a cover for intelligence gathering throughout Europe. And eventually she was released.
After the war, then, so she's not taken out. Doesn't get her head shaved. She doesn't get tarred and feathers and tied to a lamp, because people were taking their law into their own hands. So she gets out. Now I'm sitting in a studio, and if I was to stand on my desk, two things would happen. One, you get a rather good shot of my ankles, but two is I can look across and see Gibraltar, and also I can see the mountains of the Rif, and therefore Tangier, and There's a Tangier connection, isn't there?
Yes, indeed. One of the reasons she was able to get out of jail is because she met a very good-looking American serviceman who was her jailer in Paris, and she basically, she later told her daughter that he wooed her properly with chocolates. Now, that would have been a serious luxury at that time in Paris, and it's quite clear that she was able to charm him, and they did seem to have fallen in love. So he arranged for her release after the French authorities had basically shrugged their shoulders and said, "Oh, we don't really know about her, but hey, lots of people are vouching for her." And then they went to Tangier, where he was working on he was a contractor working on American air bases and also the American propaganda stations. And she got a job there.
Is this like the very early OAS then? Is this the American...
Yeah, it's the sort of voice of freedom.
Wow.
It's the American propaganda stations that were originally set up aimed at the Germans, and then sort of repurposed to be aimed at the Soviet Union, because this was the whole sort of American propaganda.
And at this time, anyway, Tangier is an international zone, isn't it? If I'm correct,
it's an international zone. It was the most bizarre place. It was run by a series of different countries, and it was his own world, but also it was quite a louche place as well. I mean, it was a very exotic. There were parties. There was a big gay scene, big social life. William Burroughs, so there was lots and lots going on. And she clearly established herself in it extremely quickly, because there's a reference in one of the local newspapers to her knowing one of the very well-known residents of it and talking about her as one of the most glamorous. And it describes her as American, but obviously the reporter had been rather bowled over by her good looks. In fact, she still had a German accent. She always kept her German
accent. Did she go back to Germany any time post-war?
She did. She did visit. She certainly visited her mum, who was still, and aunt, who was still living in Germany, and it continued to do so even after they finally went to the United States.
Right.
So, she did maintain some contacts, but then she went to live in the United States.
West Coast, East Coast? I mean, she's not going to end up in Kentucky, is she?
So they started out in Florida. They then went to Ohio.
Yeah, okay.
But then finally, she started to look for somewhere that looked like the Côte d'Azur on the south of France, which she'd always adored. And they moved to California, which is where she spent the rest of her life.
Right. I mean, unbelievable. This really is. How did you get the archive, Rory, to write this? I mean, is it a question of once you got hold of a thin end, and then you just followed this particularly glamorous tiger by its tail?
Well, it was a degree of chance. I managed to find her daughter and son both living on the West Coast.
Wow.
And I got in touch. I mean, I literally sent a letter into thin air, had no idea whether I'd got the right address or anything like that. And I thought, well, because it was one of those things I thought at one stage, I just thought I'm not going to be able to make anything of this, because certainly the British Archive didn't really have enough about her early life. They'd fairly well pinpointed that she was definitely working in espionage during the war, but they hadn't done much before. And so then I literally took a chance. I wrote to her daughter. Her daughter wrote back, and we had a couple of sort of conversations. And originally my interest was mainly in Jack Perfumer, because he was the sort of big name in this story. But then as I went on, it became more and more clear that she was the interesting one. And after I'd done a bit more research, I went out there just on spec, really. I went to talk to her and ask her and her brother whether they would help me. And very, very kindly they did. I mean, some sweaty Brit turns up on your door, starts asking, tells you your mum's a spy, because they didn't know before. And then asks for your help. And I mean, most people, I think, would have said, no, thank you very much, go away. But they didn't. And they allowed me access to her papers, her photographs. And those were the key to fill in the gaps. So there's so many gaps that there were in the official archives in both Germany, France and Britain.
I mean, I don't suppose, because this was a Hollywood movie, there would be this thing of remorse, and I don't know, she would have spent the rest of her life looking after, small animals or something like that. And I'm not saying that she's, because it's difficult to say, she's not a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi, so she just thinks it was some of the things that she did, presumably. She never addressed it.
I suspect not. I mean, she rarely talked about the Second World War to her kids. She did open up a bit to her daughter, and I mean, obviously, I've included as much of that as I can in the book. But I think that the main problem was, and I think it's what you do when you're faced with that situation. You know, effectively, you may not be in sympathy with the Nazis. You don't want to be in Germany around them. However, you've got to survive outside. And you have to remember that it wasn't that easy to move out of Germany or to get in their places. Britain had incredibly tough rules about Germans trying to get to the UK. We wouldn't allow, the British Medical Association was trying to prevent German doctors, Jewish doctors coming here. Shop workers certainly couldn't. And there were only two routes. You could either be a sort of governess for children or work in domestic work.
Indeed, it must have been quite something to see these, presumably the happy family pictures, sort of the 50s and 60s.
It was astonishing, and quite a lot of her modelling portfolio. Her daughters kept all of those, and I mean that really gave the key to who she was working for. I mean, she modelled in New York. Possibly with the help of the Kennedys, because Bergdorf Goodman, the store was used by Rose Kennedy, and Joe Kennedy, Senior and Junior, would have been able to have got her the gig there. And that was in 1938-39.
The book is called A Model Spy. It is by John Rory Maclean, who we're speaking to today. John, if people want to find you online, listeners, if you go to the TRE bookstore, you will see a picture of the beautiful model. Click on that and it'll be winging its way to you. If people want to find you online, where's the best place to make contact?
LinkedIn, Facebook. I'm on both of those, and really happy to hear from anybody about the book.
What are you on the socials on that as, by the way?
I'm as John Rory Maclean on Facebook and Rory Maclean on LinkedIn.
Marvellous stuff. The book is called A Model Spy. It's by John Rory Maclean. It's been absolutely brilliant to speak to you this morning. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.